Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The storm had been building since mid-afternoon, which on Kethara 7 meant the sky had gone the particular shade of greenish-gray that settlers learned to respect the way they respected open electrical panels and loan agreements. Eli Varro had seen it coming on the atmospheric reader above his kitchen window, the pressure graph doing what it always did before a serious blow, dropping like something had let go of it, and had spent the better part of 3 hours doing what a man alone on an outer grid homestead does before weather arrives: shuttering the external panels, running the heating coil diagnostic, moving the portable irrigation units into the equipment shelter, and then standing in his doorway for slightly longer than necessary, watching the horizon fold itself into cloud, before going back inside and accepting that the planet was going to do what the planet was going to do, and that his opinion on the matter had never once been solicited. By the time dark came, the storm had settled into the long, grinding work of a Kethara 7 pressure system, which meant wind that pushed rather than gusted, rain that fell sideways because falling straight down was apparently not ambitious enough, and visibility outside his windows reduced to roughly the length of a regret. He had eaten. He had checked the perimeter sensors twice, which was once more than they required and once fewer than anxiety recommended. He had picked up the technical manual for the irrigation scheduler, the one that had been beeping incorrectly for 2 years, operating on a cycle that corresponded to no agricultural calendar known to human science, and had put it back down again, as he always did, because the scheduler had outlasted his willingness to fix it, and he had come to regard its irregular complaints as something close to company. He was on the edge of sleep in the chair by the heater when the proximity sensor on the front threshold registered contact. Not the sharp, rhythmic ping that meant a feral pack animal circling the foundation for warmth, which happened often enough that he'd named the most persistent one Gerald. This was a long, soft pressure reading, something at the door that was not moving. He sat with this information for a moment. Gerald had never once stopped moving. Gerald was constitutionally opposed to stillness. Eli pulled on his work jacket, crossed the room, and stood with his hand on the door latch for a few seconds, listening to the storm make its case for staying inside. The latch was cold. Outside, the wind was doing something to the eaves that sounded genuinely editorial. He opened the door anyway, because the sensor didn't lie, and because there are questions a person can ignore and questions that, once registered, don't allow for it. The threshold light caught the shape on his front step at an angle, collapsed forward, face down in the mud that the rain had made of his entry path. One arm extended ahead as though the act of falling had interrupted a knock. His first coherent thought was that this was a person. His second thought, arriving close behind, was that this person was not Gerald. He was on his knees beside her in moments, 2 fingers to the side of her neck, finding a pulse that was present and working, if not enthusiastic about it. He got his arms beneath her and got her inside, which was harder than it should have been. She was slight but carried a density to her that didn't match her frame, as though her bones had been built to different specifications. And he got the door closed against the wind with the heel of his boot, and stood in his entryway breathing hard with a stranger in his arms and the irrigation scheduler bleeping cheerfully in the corner, unbothered. He brought her to the utility room, which had the best floor space and the closest access to the medical kit, and began the unhurried, methodical work of emergency care, clearing her airway, getting an ambient temperature read from the kit's diagnostic wand, cataloging the visible injuries with the careful attention of a man who had been 4 years on a planet that treated first aid as a core competency. The gash at her left temple, the bruising across her ribs, visible when he checked for deeper damage, patterned in a way that didn't read as a fall from height so much as a specific and targeted event that he chose not to theorize about while she still needed the antiseptic. It was in the dark of the utility room, with only the kit's work light running, that he first noticed the quality of her skin, the faint suggestion of light beneath it, a low pulse of luminescence at her temple and along her collarbone, visible the way a reflection is visible. The thing that tells you something is there without showing you the source. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at the medical kit. He looked back. He kept working because she needed the antiseptic more than he needed an explanation. She came back to partial consciousness while he was finishing the wound at her temple, and what she did was look at him. Not with panic, not with the disorientation of someone surfacing from unconsciousness in an unfamiliar place, but with a focused, taking stock attention that suggested her mind had come back online well ahead of her body's ability to do anything about it. Her eyes were amber and wrong in a way he couldn't immediately locate. He would not locate it until later, when he had more time and better light. And she looked at him with them for a long, assessing moment. He said, because silence in this situation felt like a failure of hospitality, "The antiseptic is going to sting. I'd apologize in advance, but fair warning seems more useful." Her expression moved by a fraction. He took this as acceptance. He gave her water. He told her which room she could use. He told her the storm would pass by morning, which he believed, because on Kethara 7 the storms always passed. They simply did so on their own schedule, without reference to anyone's preferences. He told her his name. She received all of this with the quiet attentiveness of someone keeping careful record, and then, between one breath and the next, she slept. Eli went back to the kitchen. He checked the perimeter sensors, nothing. Just the storm, just Gerald probably sheltering somewhere sensible. He made something warm and sat with it at the table, and thought that she was almost certainly from the Murrin Cooperative Settlement, 40 kilometers east, and that in the morning he would make a transport call and get her back to whoever was wondering where she was. A simple, reasonable conclusion. He was good at those. He went to bed. He slept without difficulty. This would seem, later, almost funny. Kethara 7 had a specific kind of morning that followed its serious storms, a silence so sudden and so complete that it felt less like weather ending and more like the planet briefly losing interest in you, turning its attention elsewhere while you caught your breath. Eli had learned not to trust it. The quiet was real enough, but it was the quiet of something pausing, not something finished, and 4 years of outer grid living had given him an instinct for the distinction. He woke at 6, which was when he always woke, because his body had long since concluded that alarm systems were a redundancy. The heating coils had done their work through the night. The farmhouse was warm in the specific, close way of a sealed building that had been keeping out the cold for hours, the air carrying the faint mineral smell of recycled filtration that he had stopped noticing approximately 3 years ago. He lay still for a moment, listening, and registered the absence of wind, and remembered, in the unhurried way of a man who had slept well, that he had a stranger in his spare room. He dressed. He checked the perimeter sensors. He went to the kitchen and began the sequence of actions that constituted his morning, a sequence he had refined over 4 years of solitude into something close to ceremony. The water heating element first, then the dry stores for porridge, then the comm terminal's daily atmospheric read, which told him the next significant weather system was 48 hours out, which on Kethara 7 was the forecast equivalent of a standing ovation. He turned from the terminal and found her already at the table. She had come from the spare room at some point before he woke, silently, which impressed him, given that the hallway's third floorboard had a creak he had been intending to fix for 2 years, and which currently served as a highly effective passive early warning system. She was wearing the blanket he had left across the foot of the spare room bed, wrapped around her shoulders with the particular self-sufficient tidiness of someone accustomed to making do, and she was looking at the window. Not at the glass through it, out at the post-storm landscape of his north field, where the overnight rain had settled into the soil, and the sky had gone the pale, washed color it only managed after it had exhausted itself. She was conducting an assessment. He understood this somehow before he could have said why. He said good morning. She turned and looked at him with those amber eyes, both layers of iris tracking with a precision that he found. He chose the word carefully, internally interesting, and inclined her head in a way that communicated acknowledgement, greeting, and a continued preference for not speaking, all at once. He turned back to the porridge. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said to the pot, in the comfortable tone he used when talking to himself during the long working days, which was a habit he'd developed in year 2 and reviewed without regret. "This porridge is going to look like something that happened to food rather than something made from it. I want you to know that the taste is marginally better than the appearance, which I recognize is not the endorsement I'm making it sound like." He heard nothing from the table. He took this as tolerance. The porridge came out as it always did, pale, thick, nutritionally sound in the way that things engineered for colonial settlers usually were, built for function at the open expense of any aesthetic ambition. He set a bowl in front of her with the resigned good faith of a man who has fully accepted his own limitations. She looked at it. She picked up the utensil. She ate, with a composure so complete that it briefly made the porridge seem like a dignified choice. "The noise in the corner," Eli said, sitting down across from her with his own bowl, as the irrigation scheduler produced its irregular bleep from the wall unit, "is not a malfunction. Or it is a malfunction, technically, but it's been a malfunction for long enough that I've reclassified it as a feature. It runs on a schedule that has nothing to do with the agricultural calendar or any calendar I've been able to identify. My current theory is that it's on a cycle calibrated to a different planet, possibly a different star system. I find this oddly respectful." She glanced at the scheduler, then back at him. There was something in her expression, not quite amusement, but the structural precondition for amusement, the place where it would appear if she decided to let it. He asked, carefully, if she'd like to use the comm terminal, gesturing toward it with his spoon. She looked at it for a moment that ran a beat longer than neutral, and then returned to her bowl without indicating yes or no, which was itself a kind of answer. He let it go. He had spent 4 years building a life in which pressure was the thing the weather did, not the thing people did to each other, and he saw no reason to revise that policy now. They ate in the quiet that had settled between them as naturally as weather, a silence with no discomfort in it, the kind that only exists between people who either know each other very well or have, for different reasons, made a separate peace with the condition of being alone. Outside, the pale Cathara 7 morning was doing its best. The fields ran flat and dark with moisture to the northern ridge. The sky held. At 8:17, the proximity sensors registered 3 contacts on the northern approach. Eli looked at the readout on the kitchen panel, because the panel was to his left and looking at it was automatic, and what it showed him was not the signature of Gerald, or of any feral pack animal, or of the Murrin Cooperative's battered terrain vehicle that sometimes came out this far with supply exchange orders. The system was giving him a classification it had never used before in 4 years of outer grid operation, a classification he had always assumed was in the software for bureaucratic completeness rather than practical necessity. Military-grade transport, 3 units, moving in formation. He looked at the panel. He looked at the woman across the table. She had not looked at the panel because she had not needed to. She was looking at him, and in her expression was something that had not been there before, not fear, not urgency, but the specific, composed quality of someone who has been expecting a particular moment and has, until now, been quietly hoping it wouldn't arrive quite so soon. For just a fraction of a second beneath all of that composure, she looked genuinely sorry. Then it was gone. She straightened slightly, set down her utensil, and folded her hands on the table with a stillness that was no longer just self-possession. Eli looked back at the panel. 12 individual life sign signatures were deploying from the transports in coordinated positions around his homestead perimeter, which was a response so disproportionate to anything he had ever done that he briefly ran through his recent history to make sure he hadn't forgotten something significant. He hadn't. He picked up his coffee vessel, because he had started making coffee before the sensors triggered, and it seemed a waste to abandon it now, and he stood up, and he looked at the door, and he looked at the bowl of porridge he had almost finished. And he thought, with the quiet, unhurried clarity of a man who had always been better at accepting situations than anticipating them, that the Murrin cooperative theory had probably run its course. Eli opened the door before they knocked, which he would later reflect was either his best or worst decision of the morning, depending on how one weighed the variables. He had seen the formation on the perimeter display, 12 signatures in coordinated spread. The transports holding position at the field's northern edge, with the particular stillness of machines operated by people who were very good at waiting, and had concluded, with the bleak arithmetic that Cathara 7 tended to produce in its settlers, that opening the door proactively was statistically preferable to making 12 armed professionals stand in the mud and build opinions about him. He was wearing his work jacket over his sleep clothes. He was holding his coffee vessel. He had decided, standing at the threshold, that there was nothing about his appearance he could meaningfully improve in the available time, and that the coffee was a reasonable thing to have in his hand because he had made it and it was his house. The woman on the other side of the door was in Velosian Protectorate Royal Guard armor, silver and black environmental plating, the kind of fabrication that cost more than Eli's entire farming operation, including the land lease. And she had the posture of someone who had converted approximately 22 hours of sustained fear into a focused, operational readiness that was currently looking for something to be applied to. Behind her, positioned at intervals that suggested training rather than coincidence, the rest of the detail stood in the early Cathara 7 morning like a problem that had organized itself. They looked at each other, Eli and the commander, across the threshold of his farmhouse. He said, "I don't suppose this is about the border survey dispute." The commander, her armor's rank indicator red dask, S, which Eli cataloged without entirely processing, did not change her expression, because her expression was the expression of someone who had removed all optional content and was operating on essentials only. She said, in standard with a Velosian cadence that clipped the consonants into precision instruments, "We're looking for a missing person, female, Velosian national, injuries consistent with emergency egress from a personnel carrier under hostile conditions. Our tracking systems placed a signal in this grid sector before the storm disrupted triangulation." She paused. "We have reason to believe she may have sought shelter in this location." Eli held his coffee vessel in both hands and considered several responses. He selected the one that was most honest, which was also, he recognized, the one least likely to make the next few minutes easier. "When you say missing person," he said, "are we talking about, and I want to be precise here, a person who is missing, or a person whose location is simply not yet known to you?" Commander Dask's eyes moved past him into the interior of the farmhouse, in the way that eyes do when they are attached to someone trying very hard not to simply push through a doorway on instinct. "Both," she said. "Until approximately 30 seconds ago." Eli stepped aside. There were things a person could argue and things that had already resolved themselves without requiring the argument, and the geometry of 12 armed guards and one open door was firmly in the second category. Dask came through with 2 members of the detail, the rest holding position outside with the professional patience of people on salary, and Eli led them down the short hallway to the kitchen, past the 3rd floorboard, which creaked as it always did, indifferent to the significance of the moment. She was still at the table. She had not moved from where Eli had left her, hands folded, bowl pushed slightly aside, her posture carrying the quality of someone who had finished waiting and was now simply present in the way that large facts are present, without apology or elaboration. Commander Dask stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and what happened to Dask's face in that moment was brief and entirely unguarded. 22 hours of sustained operational fear converting itself back into something human, all at once, before the professionalism moved back in and covered it over. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Eli watched it and filed it carefully. The Queen, he was already thinking of her as the Queen, because Dask's expression had done more to establish the fact than any formal announcement could have. Looked at her commander with an acknowledgement that was also an apology, that was also a very quiet instruction, all carried in the specific economy of people who have worked closely enough together to hold full conversations in the arrangement of a glance. Dask straightened. She turned back to Eli. "I need to ask you a series of questions," she said, "for the official record. Protectorate Security Protocol, Emergency Provision 14. I apologize for the formality." That's all right," Eli said. "I have time." What followed was the most paperwork-intensive 40 minutes of Eli Varro's life, which was genuinely competitive given that he had once filed a land-use variance appeal with the Cathara 7 Colonial Authority, an organization that had apparently concluded that bureaucratic complexity was itself a form of infrastructure. Dask produced a recording filament from her armor's utility panel and began working through a formal inquiry sequence that had clearly been designed for situations involving embassies, secure facilities, and people whose living arrangements included rooms that could be officially designated. It had not been designed for outer grid farmhouses, and the collision between the two produced a specific, recurring friction that Eli tried to navigate with good faith and Dask navigated with the determination of someone who had decided that the protocol would be completed correctly, or she would understand why not. She asked about his security systems. He described the perimeter sensors. She asked about their classification range. He said they went up to military-grade transport, which they both took a moment to acknowledge had been, this morning, relevant information. She asked about his defensive infrastructure. He said he had a door with a good lock and a medical kit. She wrote this down with an expression that suggested she was deciding how to categorize it and had not yet reached a conclusion. A junior guard, young, diligent, operating with the slightly overextended focus of someone on their first significant deployment, began logging the medical supplies Eli had used the previous night, cross-referencing them against a protectorate medical inventory system that had clearly been built to interface with installations that stocked professional-grade equipment. He got to the antiseptic and stopped. "Could you spell the product name, please?" he said, with the careful neutrality of someone who was fairly sure they already knew the answer and was hoping to be wrong. Eli spelled it. It was a settler market generic produced by a company whose naming philosophy appeared to prioritize accuracy over inspiration. The guard wrote it down. He looked at it. He asked Eli to confirm the spelling of the third syllable. Eli confirmed it. From the table, where she had been sitting through the entire proceeding with the quiet attention of someone watching a cultural exchange of significant anthropological interest. Sale. He still did not know her name, but he had decided internally that she needed one, and the way Dask had used it once, under her breath, while checking her communications, had provided it, made a small sound that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a laugh. Everyone looked at her. She looked at the window. Dask asked Eli whether he had, at any point during the previous night, accessed or attempted to access any communications equipment in the presence of the, she paused for the length of a breath, the visitor. Eli said he had offered her the use of the comm terminal, and she had declined. Dask noted this. She asked whether he had any knowledge of the current political situation within the Velosian Protectorate. Eli said that he received a news digest twice weekly, but that the outer grid's atmospheric interference made reception inconsistent, and he was frequently several days behind. Dask absorbed this. She seemed, for a moment, to be having a private experience of what it would mean to be several days behind the current political situation within the Velosian Protectorate, and to be having it somewhere in the vicinity of a root crop farm. She collected herself. she asked, finally, with the deliberate precision of someone completing a form that required the information regardless of how self-evident it had become. To your knowledge, were you aware at any point during the night of the identity or rank of the individual currently present at your kitchen table? Eli thought about the threshold light, the mud, the long pulse of the proximity sensor, the focused amber eyes coming back to consciousness in his utility room, the bowl of porridge accepted with the quiet dignity of a state occasion. "No," he said, with complete honesty. "I thought she was from the Murrin Cooperative." Dask wrote this down. Across the table very briefly, Sale closed her eyes. The mobile command structure went up in Eli's north pasture in under 20 minutes, which was the most impressive thing he had witnessed since arriving on Cathara 7, and the competition was not trivial. He had once watched a pressure storm dismantle a reinforced equipment shelter in 11 minutes flat, and had always considered that the benchmark for efficiency on this planet. The Protectorate apparently had different benchmarks. By 9 in the morning, his north pasture contained a deployable operations center, 4 additional transports, a communications array that was almost certainly capable of reaching the inner systems, without the atmospheric interference that made his news digest unreliable, and approximately 30 personnel conducting activities that Eli could observe from his kitchen window with the same detached curiosity he brought to most things that were happening near him, but not, technically, to him. He had been asked, with great courtesy and absolute firmness, to remain in his farmhouse while the immediate security assessment was completed. He had agreed, because it was a reasonable request, and because there was nowhere he particularly needed to be, and he had spent the intervening time doing the things that required doing regardless of what was happening in the north pasture. Checking the moisture levels in the eastern field plots, running the post-storm diagnostic on the heating coils, and replacing the filter cartridge in the water reclamation unit, which had been due for replacement for 2 weeks, and which he had been postponing with the specific optimism of a man who believes the inconvenient task will somehow become less inconvenient if given enough time to contemplate its own necessity. He was on his 3rd coffee when Commander Dask came back to his door and told him, with the clipped formality that appeared to be her natural register, that he was cleared to move about the property. He went outside and stood at the edge of his east field, where the storm-soaked soil was already beginning to firm in the pale morning warmth, and looked at his farm the way he occasionally allowed himself to look at it, not as an inventory of tasks, but as a thing that existed, that he had made exist, out here at the far edge of a colonial grid on a planet that had never once asked for his opinion. 4 years. The root crops were in their 3rd rotation. The yield margins had improved every season. He had learned, out of pure necessity, more about atmospheric soil chemistry than he had known existed as a subject. He had become, without entirely planning it, a person who was good at staying. He heard her approach, or rather, he heard the careful repositioning of the 2-guard proximity detail that accompanied her, because she herself moved as she always apparently moved, without sound, without announcement. She came to stand beside him at the field's edge, the borrowed blanket replaced now by a Protectorate field jacket that one of her detail had produced, and she looked out at the same middle distance he was looking at, and for a stretch of time neither of them said anything, which was, between them, already a familiar country. It was Sale who spoke first. "Varro," she said, his surname, carrying it with the same care she had given the porridge, the spare room, all the small things he had offered without ceremony. "I placed you in a difficult position." "You placed yourself in my doorstep," he said. The position followed naturally. She considered this. The colonial authority will want to conduct their own inquiry. There will be interest from the Protectorate press. Your name will appear in official communications. "I've had worse things happen to me on this planet," he said. "Last spring, a contaminated nutrient batch took out my entire western plot. I had to renegotiate my exchange contract from a position of embarrassing weakness. This seems manageable by comparison. The silence that followed had something different in it, something that had moved, fractionally, in a direction that felt like ease. He asked her then because the morning was clear and the question had been sitting in him since the utility room floor, whether she would tell him what had happened. Not the political architecture of it, not the protectorate security implications, just the shape of it. How a person ends up face down in the mud of an outer grid threshold in the middle of a Cathara 7 pressure storm. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer, and he was already preparing to accept this with the equanimity that the situation deserved, when she said, "There are people who would prefer that the Velosian protectorate had a different sovereign." They made a considered argument. A pause. The argument involved a personnel carrier at altitude and a great deal of optimism on their part regarding the outcome. Eli thought about the bruising pattern across her ribs, the kind that didn't read as a fall. They were wrong, he said. Comprehensively, she agreed. Behind them, the communications array in the North Pasture was cycling through what sounded like a high-volume coordination sequence, voices carrying fragments of Velosian standard across the field in the flat morning air. Commander Dask's voice, identifiable at any distance by its quality of controlled urgency, was directing something with the efficiency of a person who had been waiting to direct something for 22 hours and was finding the experience of finally doing so almost restorative. A junior guard somewhere near the transports dropped a piece of equipment with a sound that echoed across the field, followed by a silence that suggested the guard was performing an internal review of recent decisions. Eli felt, rather than decided, that something was shifting, not in the field, not in the morning, but in the specific accounting he had kept of himself since arriving on Cathara 7. He had come here for reasons he didn't discuss, had stayed for reasons that had slowly replaced the original ones, had built something out here in the outer grid that was genuinely his in a way that very few things had ever been. He had thought of it as a life conducted at a useful distance from consequence. Standing in the mud of his east field with a queen from another civilization and 30 soldiers reorganizing his north pasture, he was revising this assessment in real time. "The scheduler," Sale said. He looked at her. "This morning, you said it operates on a cycle that corresponds to no known agricultural calendar." She paused. "Velosian Standard Time uses a 26.4-hour day. The Protectorate agricultural systems are all calibrated to it. If someone had previously registered this unit under a colonial aid subsidy program, which the outer grid settlements received 11 years ago, it would have shipped with Velosian base calibration." Eli considered this at some length. He looked back at his farmhouse. He thought about the scheduler, its irregular bleep, its 2 years of cheerful incoherence. He thought about the fact that it had apparently been keeping perfect time the entire time, just for a planet he had never been to. "I've been calling it broken," he said. "It isn't. I owe it an apology." This time the sound she made was unambiguous. It was brief, and it was real, and it crossed her face like something that had been waiting for an opening, and it changed the whole arrangement of her expression for the moment it lasted, and Eli found he was glad to have been present for it. Dask appeared at the edge of the field. She looked at her queen, then at Eli, with the expression of someone completing a threat assessment and arriving at an unexpected conclusion. She informed Sale, with formal precision, that the secure transit window opened in 40 minutes and that the Inner Systems medical team was standing by at the orbital station. Sale acknowledged this. She did not immediately move. "The crop yields," she said to Eli without preamble. "You said they've improved each season." "Third rotation's looking strong," he said. "The soil chemistry on Cathara 7 responds well once you stop fighting it and start working with it." "That's a principle with applications beyond agriculture," she said. "I've noticed," he said. She looked at him with those layered amber eyes for a moment that had weight to it, The kind of weight that doesn't come from a single night or a single morning but from something that has decided, quietly, to continue. Then she turned and walked back across the field toward the command structure, the detail falling into formation beside her, and Eli watched until the distance had done what distance does. He stood in his east field for a while after she had gone, in the specific Kethara 7 quiet that followed the departure of 30 personnel and 4 military transports, which turned out to be a much more noticeable quiet than the kind that followed storms. His north pasture was empty again, or nearly. The ground showed the geometric impressions of the operation structure, the transport landing pads, 12 sets of armored boots, all of it already beginning to soften at the edges as the soil did what soil does. He went inside. The irrigation scheduler bleeped, right on its incomprehensible schedule from the wall unit in the corner. He stood in front of it for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular and to it specifically, "I was wrong about you, I apologize, you've been right the whole time." He paused. "That makes 2 of us this week." He put the water heating element on for another coffee, checked the atmospheric reader, 46 hours to the next system, which was almost generous, and sat down at the kitchen table where she had eaten his terrible porridge with the gravity of a diplomatic occasion. And he thought about staying, which was something he had done every morning for 4 years, the quiet daily decision that had built everything around him. He thought about it now, and it felt, for the first time, like it had been building towards something rather than simply away from something else. He drank his coffee. Outside, Kethara 7 held its breath, the way it always did, deciding what came next. He found curious.